Chapter 7, Avoidance and Punishment. Research on punishment. This video covers the 6 factors affecting the effectiveness of punishment at decreasing behavior as described in Chapter 7 and based on a foundational book chapter called Punishment by Mazur and Holtz. This is not an exhaustive list of factors affecting punishment. In class, we'll discuss some of the disadvantages of using punishment and some logistical and ethical considerations. The first factor is the manner of introduction, specifically, the initial intensity of the punishment relative to its eventual intensity. Mazur and Holtz in 1966 recommended introducing a punisher at its full intensity on the first trial, or the instance when it's used, because subjects can habituate to mild punishers. Introducing a punisher at its full strength right away maximizes its suppressive effect on the behavior you want to disappear. In a laboratory experiment, Mazur, Holtz, and Hake reported that an 80-volt shock completely suppressed pigeons' key pecking when it was introduced on the first trial. But if the first trial involved a lower voltage, pigeons kept responding at much higher voltages, even when the shock was 130 volts. In other words, an 80-volt shock was an effective punisher for key pecking if it was introduced right away, but not when there were opportunities to habituate to lower voltage shocks. An applied example of this might be the difference between the 3 strikes versus 0 tolerance approaches for suspendable offenses in school. Suspending a kid the first time she gets into a fight should be a more effective way of preventing her from fighting in the future than giving her a warning or detention for the first 2 fights and suspending her for the 3rd. Now, if you played version C of the shaping game earlier in the semester, you experienced how dramatically even a 2-second delay in delivering a reinforcer can impact its efficacy. Delayed punishment can be similarly ineffective at decreasing behavior. For example, in an applied experiment published in Behavior Therapy in 1990, Anne Abramowitz and Susan O'Leary had teachers deliver verbal reprimands to punish off-task behavior in 1st and 2nd grade children. Sometimes the reprimands were immediate, and other times they were delivered after a 2-minute delay. When teachers did not provide specific consequences for off-task behavior, the children were pretty frequently off-task. When they reprimanded off-task behavior after a 2-minute delay, it did decrease a little bit to 79% of the baseline rate. But when teachers provided immediate verbal reprimands for off-task behavior, it almost completely disappeared. Like positive reinforcers, punishers need not be delivered after every occurrence of a behavior. I hope you recall from Module 6 that different schedules of reinforcement produce different patterns of behavior. Of course, there's a corollary with punishers. Different schedules of punishment produce different patterns of suppression. For the most part, punishers and reinforcers can be shown to have opposite effects on behavior. For example, a fixed interval schedule of reinforcement produces an accelerating pattern of responding. But a fixed interval schedule of punishment can produce a deceleration, declining response rates as the next punisher approaches. You might remember that continuous reinforcement, where you reinforce every occurrence of a behavior, does not produce the highest rates of behavior. Intermittent schedules of reinforcement, especially variable ratio schedules with elements of unpredictability, can produce more responding than continuous reinforcement. However, Mazur and Holtz concluded that the most effective way to eliminate a behavior is to punish every response, rather than to use some intermittent schedule of punishment. In an experiment with rats, Mazur and colleagues demonstrated that shocks were most effective at eliminating lever pressing when they occurred after every lever press as opposed to on a leaner fixed ratio schedule. Similarly, other research with humans suggests that the most powerful way to reduce behavior is to punish every occurrence. As Azrin and Holtz noted, the effectiveness of a punishment procedure is inversely related to the intensity of the individual's motivation to respond. The threat of jail is more than sufficient to keep most people from stealing because the motivation to steal is relatively low. But if stealing were the only way to obtain life-saving medicine for their children, jail wouldn't deter many parents. Azrin and colleagues demonstrated a version of this empirically in an experiment with pigeons. After training pigeons to peck keys for food, sometimes they gave the pigeons extra food during their daily feed to lower the pigeons' motivation to peck for food during those experimental sessions. When pigeons had extra food outside of the operant chamber, a mild shock was sufficient to completely eliminate key pecking. But when they didn't get that extra food, pigeons would keep pecking for food, even though the pecking also sometimes produced shocks. One of the more reliable and, in my opinion, the more appealing ways to increase the effectiveness of a punishment is to pair it with reinforcement of an alternative response. It's not in your textbook, but many researchers have shown that a relatively mild or weak punisher, such as an infrequent low-intensity shock, can be sufficient to eliminate a response so long as reinforcement is available for a different response. In other words, it can be really hard to get a pigeon to just stop pecking a key for food, but it can be much easier to get the same pigeon to switch from pecking one key to pecking a different one. In a study with 4 children who engaged in frequent self-injurious behaviors such as hitting themselves or headbanging, Thompson, Iwata, Connors, and Roscoe showed how the availability of an alternative source of reinforcement can increase the effectiveness of a punishment procedure. Before treatment began, a suitable reinforcer was found for each child, such as a toy or game or a string of beads. During treatment, every response of a self-injurious behavior was followed by mild punishment, such as a brief physical restraint or a verbal reprimand. On some days, the alternative reinforcer preferred by each child was available, whereas on other days, the alternative reinforcer was not available. This graph, which is figure 7.5 in the textbook, shows that the punishment alone did reduce self-injurious behavior by at least half for all 4 children. However, when a reinforcer was available for an alternative response, behavior decreased much more. Imagine an experiment in which a pigeon's response goes unpunished during some portions of the session, but responses are followed by shock during other parts of the session. Now imagine that each time the shock begins, the pigeon's response rate actually increases. This behavior can seem paradoxical until we learn that the pigeon can obtain food only during those periods when its responses are punished. An extinction schedule, where no food is delivered, is in effect during the periods when responses are not shocked. This is exactly what Azrin and Holtz did in an experiment published in the Journal of the Experimental Analysis of Behavior in 1961. We talked recently about how consequences don't have to be rewarding to function as reinforcers, and they don't have to be aversive to function as punishers. Since pecking increases in the presence of shocks, you might be tempted to say that shocks reinforced key pecking. However, in Holtz and Azrin's experiment, the shocks following responses weren't functioning as reinforcers, but rather as discriminative stimuli for the availability of food reinforcement, because they were the only stimuli that differentiated between periods of reinforcement and extinction. Azrin and Holtz suggested that similar explanations may account for some instances of self-injurious behaviors that appear equally paradoxical at first glance.